August 6, 1945. The air in the basement war room beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was thick with the stale scent of papers, smoke, and the faint tang of sweat. The dim light barely touched the faces of the generals and staff officers hunched over maps and intelligence reports for months, maybe years. They had rehearsed this morning ritual, the daily briefing that confirmed what they already feared. The war was slipping from their grasp, yet today would be unlike any other. At exactly 8:15 hours, the silence of the underground chamber was shattered by the sudden clatter of steel boots on concrete. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, normally composed and methodical, burst through the reinforced door without bowing, a breach of protocol that sent a ripple of unease across the room. In his hands, he clutched a radio transmission, still warm with urgency, that would rewrite everything the high command thought they knew about the war. Hiroshima no longer exists. The words hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of every officer present. The room went still, the usual rustle of papers and whispered consultations fading to nothing. Eyes met across the table, wide, uncomprehending. Generals who had faced months of losses, who had stared down defeat after defeat, now grappled with a truth that seemed almost impossible. Could an entire city, Hiroshima, a bustling hub of life and industry, truly have been erased in a single instant? General Yoshiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, reached out with trembling fingers. Taking the message from Yamamoto, his eyes scanned the lines repeatedly, as if reading it more than once could somehow restore reality. 1,000 scenarios ran through his mind: a massive conventional bombing raid, a fluke of misreported intelligence, even some elaborate American deception. But none of them fit. The words on the page were cold and precise, and yet they spoke of a horror that no doctrine, no training, no preparation could mitigate. The other generals shifted uncomfortably, the weight of disbelief pressing down. Admiral Swamuto Yoda moved toward the wall map, tracing every American military asset in the Pacific with a trembling hand. 3 aircraft, he whispered, almost to himself, as if saying it aloud might make it impossible. Yet the intelligence was clear: not 300, not 50, 3, and in their wake, a city vanished outside. The summer sun climbed higher, indifferent to the devastation that had unfolded hundreds of miles away. Inside the room, time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with a mixture of fear, awe, and incomprehension. The generals sat frozen, some gripping the edge of the table, others staring at the blank walls as if looking for answers that could not exist. A single bomb had shattered not just a city, but every assumption about the war, about American power, and about the fragile illusion of control they had clung to for years. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence was not respectful, it was stunned, trembling with the gravity of the impossible. In that quiet, every officer understood, on some instinctive level, that nothing would ever be the same again. Hiroshima had fallen, and with it, the final veil of certainty the Japanese high command had relied upon. Outside the reinforced walls, the world continued as it always had, but inside that basement, 90 feet below Tokyo, history had arrived, and it came with a single, devastating message. The war was no longer theirs to shape, it was theirs to witness. The words lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding. Hiroshima no longer exists. The room, a dimly lit chamber 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace, seemed to shrink under their weight. Generals and staff officers, men who had spent years calculating strategies and studying enemy movements, froze. Their world, the carefully constructed universe of tactics, numbers, and doctrine, was suddenly unrecognizable. One general adjusted his glasses nervously, pushing them higher on the bridge of his nose as if doing so might bring clarity to what his eyes refused to accept. Another chuckled, a hollow, uncomfortable sound, masking the fear that clawed at his chest. "It's impossible," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "One bomb. It cannot destroy an entire city, not Hiroshima, not in a single strike." Laughter, shuddering and awkward, rippled quietly across the room. It was a defense, a fragile barrier against the encroaching reality. They had seen death, destruction, and defeat, yet this annihilation defied every lesson they had learned. Maps and charts, painstakingly compiled over years, seemed suddenly meaningless. The geometry of warfare, the calculations of logistics, the limits of ordnance, all rendered irrelevant in the face of a single, unseen force. General Umezu, seated stiffly at the head of the table, stared at the message, eyes narrowing as if sheer focus could bend the truth back into something manageable. 3 aircraft, someone murmured, almost as if speaking the words aloud could make them vanish. But there it was, staring back from the page like an accusation. 3 aircraft, and a city reduced to nothing. The silence that followed was dense, a tangible thing pressing down on every man in the room. No one wanted to be the first to speak, to give voice to the fear curling in their guts. Their training had taught them to confront danger, to calculate risks, to accept casualties as part of strategy, but no preparation could have equipped them for this. This was not a loss they could study and adapt to. This was a paradigm shift, a force that bent reality itself. Eyes darted to each other, searching for confirmation, for some collective denial that would make this impossible reality fade. Yet the faces that met theirs were pale, strained, and equally terrified. Each man saw the same question reflected back. How could this happen? How could one bomb obliterate what thousands of soldiers, engineers, and planners could not? In the corner, a junior officer swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in his mouth. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as if movement could restore logic. But there was none. Nothing in 3 years of war suggested that a city, its people, its factories, and its streets could vanish in an instant. The laws of warfare, the rules that had governed every battle, every calculation had been broken. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, denial clung stubbornly to their minds. They searched for excuses, for explanations, anything to preserve the fragile sense of order that had guided them through countless defeats. The room hummed with the unspoken truth. To acknowledge reality would be to admit that everything they believed about this war, about their enemy, and about their own abilities, had been catastrophically wrong. For a moment, the generals were not strategists or leaders. They were men staring into the impossible, grasping for reason, and finding only the yawning void of uncertainty. Hiroshima was gone, and in that absence, so too was their certainty, their pride, and the illusion that they understood the enemy. By mid-morning, the disbelief that had gripped the war room began to give way to a chilling, silent tension. First, fragmentary reports, then reconnaissance aircraft brave enough or perhaps foolish enough to penetrate the radiation zone, returned with what no one in the room could have imagined: photographs. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, still pale from the shock of the radio message, carefully handed the first prints across the table. Fingers trembled as generals leaned forward, eyes straining in the dim light of the underground chamber. What they saw was not devastation, not the ruins of a city after firebombing or conventional attack. This was something far more incomprehensible. Hiroshima had been erased. The photographs, developed with painstaking care by intelligence units, depicted a cityscape flattened to nothing but ash and scorched earth. Streets, buildings, and landmarks, everything that had given life and form to Hiroshima, were gone. There were no walls standing, no chimneys jutting into the sky, not rubble, not debris, not even recognizable silhouettes, just a barren landscape that stretched for miles, a silent testament to a force the human mind struggled to comprehend. One general gasped, gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Another turned away, blinking rapidly, unwilling or perhaps unable to confront what his eyes had just witnessed. The images seemed unreal, almost surreal, yet there was no question of their authenticity. This was the city, this had been Hiroshima, and now it was as if it had never existed at all. Whispers rippled through the room, voices low, almost reverent. "It's not damaged," one officer finally breathed. "It's erased." The words hung in the air, echoing off the reinforced walls, carrying with them a weight that no amount of military reasoning could lighten. Erased. Not by fire, not by collapse, not by bombardment. Erased, as if the very essence of the city had been swept away, leaving nothing behind to mourn, nothing to rebuild. Admiral Toyota stood in front of the massive wall map, tracing the outline of Hiroshima with a trembling finger. He did not speak. Words felt inadequate, incapable of conveying the scale of what these photographs had proven. For hours, the room remained in stunned silence, generals and officers staring at the images as if the photographs themselves were a living entity, whispering the grim reality. The nature of war had changed, and nothing could ever prepare them for what humanity was now capable of. Even the most hardened military men, trained to confront death and destruction daily, found themselves shaken. They had fought battles, survived ambushes, endured firestorms, but this obliteration transcended every experience, every calculation, every doctrine they had held sacred. Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a lesson in absolute power, a revelation that could not be ignored, rationalized, or denied. The photographs did not just depict destruction, they demanded comprehension, demanded surrender to the reality of human ingenuity and the terrifying consequences of its application. And in that room, 90 feet beneath Tokyo, the generals understood something fundamental. The world they had known, the rules, the assumptions, the very fabric of strategic thought had been irreversibly altered. Hiroshima had vanished, and with it, the illusion that Japan could endure the war unscathed evaporated into ash. The photographs had spoken louder than any radio transmission ever could. The generals, still reeling from the impossible sight of a city erased, now faced the unthinkable. Their most cherished assumptions about the enemy, beliefs that had guided strategy, justified sacrifice, and sustained morale were suddenly invalid. For years, Japanese military doctrine had rested on three pillars, simple yet unshakable in their minds. First, distance. The vast Pacific Ocean, stretching thousands of miles between Japan and the United States, had always been considered a protective barrier. American forces, so the theory went, could not project power effectively across such distances. Supply lines would fail, logistics would crumble. America, despite its industrial might, would be exhausted long before it reached Japanese shores. Second, morale. American society, believed to be soft and indulgent, could not withstand the attrition of war. 30,000 casualties here, 50,000 there. Japan could bleed them slowly, eroding their will. In every calculation, it was assumed that the public would demand an end to the war long before Japan's resources were depleted. Third, the indomitable Japanese spirit, superior training, disciplined soldiers, and unwavering devotion to emperor and country could, it was believed, overcome both numbers and technology. One soldier might equal 3 or 4 Americans on the battlefield. Courage and resolve could offset material shortages and even the most advanced weaponry. These beliefs, reinforced by years of selective victories and a culture of disciplined denial, had become the backbone of strategic planning. Every setback was reinterpreted as temporary, every loss a minor adjustment in a plan that could still succeed. And yet, here in the basement war room, they faced the undeniable truth. Hiroshima had shattered all three pillars in an instant. Distance had offered no protection. A single aircraft, carrying a weapon beyond imagination, had annihilated an entire city thousands of miles from American shores. The ocean, once considered a shield, had proven irrelevant. Morale was no longer a calculable factor. The scale and precision of destruction revealed a society capable of sustaining unimaginable losses, while simultaneously innovating and producing weapons that defied comprehension. America's ability to fight, to endure, to multiply effort beyond all expectation had been underestimated catastrophically, and the Japanese spirit, that cornerstone of pride and doctrine, was rendered tragically insufficient. The courage and training that had once seemed capable of countering overwhelming odds could not withstand the force of science and industry wielded with precision. Heroism and sacrifice could not replace the reality of technological supremacy and industrial might. As the generals absorbed the photographs, the silence was deafening. For the first time, they were forced to confront what they had spent the entire war refusing to admit. The war they thought they were fighting, the one where spirit and cunning could overcome material, had never existed. They had been preparing for ghosts, fighting battles based on illusion. Hiroshima did not just destroy a city, it destroyed the framework of belief itself. The men shifted uneasily in their seats. Papers rustled, fingers traced outlines on maps that now seemed irrelevant. Eyes flicked from photograph to photograph, trying in vain to find some familiar logic. But the logic they had relied upon was gone. What remained was stark, brutal, and undeniable. Everything they believed about America, about warfare, about themselves, had been wrong. As the generals sat in stunned silence, the weight of comprehension began to press upon them like the reinforced walls around the war room. Hiroshima was not merely a tragedy, it was a revelation, a message written in ash and fire about the nature of the enemy they had spent years underestimating. The Japanese high command, trained to calculate advantage in numbers, terrain, and morale, was now forced to recognize something far more fundamental. The Americans were operating on a level of power that transcended conventional metrics. It was not just their industrial capacity, though that alone was staggering. It was not merely the quantity of planes, ships, or tanks. What struck the generals most profoundly was the precision, the scientific ingenuity, and the unity of effort that the photographs made undeniable. A single bomb, delivered by a lone aircraft, had accomplished in moments what hundreds of bombers and thousands of tons of ordnance could not. Hiroshima had vanished, not through attrition or luck, but through the calculated application of knowledge, technology, and coordination. Admiral Toyota leaned closer to the wall map, tracing imagined lines across the Pacific, imagining the logistics that had made this possible. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and laborers, working in secrecy, had combined intellect and industry in a manner that made Japanese calculations obsolete. Their enemy had mastered the art of concentrating power, of translating ideas into instruments of unimaginable consequence. This was not brute force, it was force refined, sharpened, and aimed with the inevitability of mathematics. The generals could feel it, the assumptions that had guided their strategies, distance as protection, enemy softness, the primacy of spirit crumbled under the weight of one incontrovertible fact: America could strike anywhere, with precision, and with devastating effect. Every plan Japan had relied upon, every defensive perimeter, every calculation of attrition, was suddenly irrelevant. The enemy was no longer a nation of predictable weaknesses, but a civilization capable of bending the laws of war to its will. Even more unsettling was the realization that this single weapon was not the sum of American capability. It was merely a glimpse. If one bomb could erase a city, what other forces, what other inventions, what other concentrations of intellect and industry were quietly waiting in the wings? The generals, hardened by years of combat and conditioned to measure strength in thousands of men or tons of steel, were forced to reckon with the terrifying idea that they had never been fighting equals. They had been confronting an adversary whose imagination, unity, and scientific mastery dwarfed anything Japan could field. In a war room, the silence was no longer merely disbelief. It had transformed into a heavy, oppressive acknowledgement. They were witnessing the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one in which courage, willpower, and even numbers counted for far less than knowledge, organization, and technological brilliance. The Americans had demonstrated that victory need not be earned through slow, grinding attrition or heroic last stands. Victory could be created, synthesized, and delivered in a single, devastating stroke. And in that moment, every general present understood something chilling. Japan had not merely lost a city. Japan had glimpsed the true nature of its adversary. And there was no battlefield, no strategy, no heroism that could bridge the gulf that Hiroshima had revealed. The Americans were operating on a plane Japan had never imagined, and the war, for all their training and valor, had already been lost in the very concept of its execution. Hiroshima was not just a message, it was a mirror, reflecting the stark, unavoidable truth. Courage could not overcome chemistry, spirit could not overcome science, and in the end, the war was no longer theirs to win. Before the morning sun had fully risen, the war room was already tense with a grim anticipation. The reports from Hiroshima had unsettled even the most hardened generals, but lingering doubts, however faint, still clung to the edges of their reasoning. Could it really have been a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime miracle of destruction? Perhaps a single city had been erased, but maybe Japan could still endure. Those doubts were obliterated at 11:02 hours on August 9, 1945. A second message crackled over the radio lines: Nagasaki, completely destroyed, casualties catastrophic. The communication ended abruptly, leaving a silence heavier than any spoken words could convey. No photographs, no further analysis, just the stark, terrifying reality that another city, this time untouched by previous devastation, had been annihilated with the same inconceivable precision. The generals stared at one another, and in that moment, pretense and denial evaporated. There were no adjustments of glasses, no nervous laughter, no attempts to rationalize the impossible. The truth pressed down on them like a physical weight, unyielding and undeniable. America was not just powerful, it was operating on a plane so far beyond Japanese comprehension that prior strategies, assumptions, and calculations were rendered meaningless. Admiral Toyota, who had once traced every American movement with obsessive precision, now leaned heavily on the table, voice low, almost a whisper. "We are fighting a country that can erase us without even seeing us." The room fell into stunned silence once more. Every officer present, every strategist and war planner, realized that what they were confronting was not merely an opponent but a force that had redefined the very rules of warfare. For months, years, even, the high command had clung to comforting illusions. Distance would protect them. Americans were soft and fragile, and Japanese spirit could turn the tide against overwhelming odds. Those illusions had guided plans, justified sacrifices, and offered hope amid defeats. But Nagasaki proved, with horrifying clarity, that all those assumptions were false. The enemy was precise, relentless, and capable of exerting unmatched power instantly, at will, and from afar. The generals' faces, usually masks of stoic discipline, reflected a mixture of fear, awe, and resignation. Maps were studied in vain, strategies debated silently, calculations rendered irrelevant. Nothing they had prepared for could stop what had already been done. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, and with them, the comforting notion that victory might still be within reach. No one spoke of surrender, yet protocol and pride demanded formality. But the psychological defeat was complete. The war room had transformed from a center of planning to a chamber of reckoning. Each officer understood, perhaps more deeply than ever before, that continued resistance was not only futile but suicidal. The enemy they had underestimated for long years had proven its superiority, not in a slow grind of attrition, but in swift, decisive, and terrifying terms. In that quiet, oppressive hour, the Japanese high command confronted the starkest truth of all. The war had already been lost, not through a lack of courage or loyalty, but because they had misjudged the very nature of their adversary. The atomic bombs were not merely weapons, they were a revelation. They revealed the unimaginable scale of American industry, science, and resolve. They revealed the final, devastating reality. Japan was powerless against a force capable of erasing entire cities, with a precision and certainty that no human spirit, however indomitable, could counter. The war had ended, but the echoes of its revelations continued to reverberate through the minds of Japan's former military leaders. In the months following surrender, a new and almost unbearable truth began to crystallize, one that extended far beyond the destruction of cities or the loss of lives. Through occupation channels and painstaking investigations, they discovered the full scope of the Manhattan Project, the secret engine behind the bombs that had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was staggering. Entire cities had been built in isolation. Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, each a vast, humming monument to industry and intellect. Over 130,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians had labored, their efforts coordinated with mathematical precision. Budgets ran into billions of dollars, consuming resources Japan could not have imagined mustering even if its entire empire had been devoted to the task. Factories rivaled the scale of major cities, producing materials and experiments that no Japanese strategist had ever conceived possible. The Americans had transformed knowledge into weapons, theory into annihilation. Former generals pored over reports, photographs, and technical diagrams, struggling to reconcile what they had learned with everything they had believed. For decades, Japan had exalted courage above all else. Valor, honor, and the indomitable spirit of the soldier were considered sufficient to overcome any enemy, any disadvantage. Countless battles had been fought and lost in the name of this philosophy, each defeat rationalized as a temporary setback, each heroic last stand a testament to the transcendent power of the human will. And yet, America had shown them a starkly different principle. Knowledge, research, and coordinated intellect were the true instruments of power. Courage alone, no matter how pure or ferocious, could not erase a city or shatter the foundations of a nation. Where Japan had relied on devotion and determination, the Americans had relied on planning, innovation, and the relentless application of scientific understanding. One hand had held the laws of physics, the other the machinery of mass production, and the result had been instantaneous, unassailable devastation. The contrast was humbling, almost unbearable. Courage, which had been worshipped as the ultimate measure of strength, was revealed to be insufficient when measured against industrial genius and disciplined innovation. Japanese leaders, once confident that spirit could bridge any material gap, now saw the truth in full clarity. Civilization's power rested not only in bravery or sacrifice, but in the capacity to imagine, design, and execute on a scale so vast it defied intuition. Even years later, when interviewed by occupation historians, former commanders reflected with a mixture of shame, awe, and reluctant admiration. They spoke of a civilization that had harmonized knowledge and action in ways Japan had never attempted. A nation capable of sustaining mass production while simultaneously pioneering scientific frontiers. They admitted that in their blind devotion to courage, they had failed to appreciate that knowledge itself could be a weapon more formidable than the samurai spirit. And so, the final lesson of the war etched itself into history. While Japan had fought with valor, America had fought with understanding. One had worshipped the human heart, the other had mastered the human mind. The atomic bomb was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of that truth, a monument to the terrifying, transformative power of knowledge when harnessed with precision and unity. As the smoke cleared from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan lay in ruins, a profound realization settled over those who had survived. Courage, bravery, and valor, virtues that had defined generations of warriors, had proven powerless against the force of knowledge applied at scale. The atomic bombs were not merely instruments of destruction, they were the ultimate expression of intellect, innovation, and collective effort. Where Japan had relied on spirit alone, America had wielded knowledge, transforming ideas into a force capable of reshaping the world. The lesson was harsh, and it left no room for denial. Every warning ignored, every illusion of invincibility, every misplaced pride had culminated in this irreversible moment. The war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in failing to understand the true measure of human potential, the ability to transform knowledge into power that could protect or destroy. Yet, in that bitter lesson, there was hope. Knowledge, when guided by wisdom, can heal as well as harm. It can build civilizations, cure diseases, and elevate humanity. Courage alone could not safeguard a nation, but the responsible use of knowledge could shape a better future. The camera pans over empty streets and flattened buildings, silent witnesses to what happens when knowledge is ignored or underestimated. Then, a voice, calm but resolute, rises above the silence, and in the end knowledge won. But history does not end with a statement. It is a challenge, a call to every one of us to innovate responsibly, to question boldly, to use what we know not just for pride or power, but to create, to protect, and to uplift. We cannot undo the past, but we can learn from it. So today, let this lesson guide your actions. Seek knowledge relentlessly, apply it wisely, and when you have the power to change the world, choose to change it for the better, because the same force that destroyed cities can also save them, and it is up to us to decide which path to take. The final line lands, echoing with weight and urgency. Knowledge won. Now, it's your turn to use it wisely.